Let's talk about extraterrestrials, aliens, however you call them, otherworldly beings, multidimensional entities. If anybody's out there, please comment, because yesterday I was doing lives and they weren't showing me the comments, so then it just ends up being like a 40-minute monologue. And apparently Gary was on here earlier and they also wouldn't show him the comments. So if you're out there, comment your favorite color just so I can see that there's a comment, or a question would be amazing, because I still don't see any comments. What about asking a question in the question box? I see requests to come on video, but without knowing what the request is, I can't. All right, we're getting some comments coming in. So yesterday I was interviewing somebody who's been interviewing people in the world of UFOs, which they now call unidentified aerial phenomenon. So they've rebranded UFO to UAP. And it's Alan Steinfeld, interviewing him for a podcast, which will be coming out in a few weeks. But we talked a lot about, he's interviewed people for decades. He's got tens of millions of views on YouTube, wrote a book called Making Contact. But my point of all this is because when you consider the possibility that there's other dimensions, other realities, other humanoids in the realm of existence, it prompts the question of what is reality and how do I fit into it? And that seems to be a lot of people that I speak with who are struggling. One of the things that come out of their mouth is, I feel like I don't belong here, or they don't fit in, or they can't get grounded as a person. And I think that that's pretty natural to feel if we're assuming that reality operates one way, but it really operates another way, right? So if we're taught that this is a static reality and that we're traveling through time, that there is a past that we cannot change, and there is a future that we will be experiencing, not now, but sometime in the future, and that what we do now is going to cause the future events, it can be stressful because there's other alternatives, there's other perspectives of how this all happens. But before I go on anymore, has anybody here had, just because if nobody's had these contact experiences, we might as well not talk about it, but has anybody here had any contact experiences with extra-dimensional or extraterrestrial beings? We're also fed the program that they're going to land in a spaceship and they're going to come out and they're going to speak to us, or they're going to do what we do, which is war, encapsulate, dominate. And so these Hollywood stories of how they would show up isn't always how they do it. So my experience is seeing orbs of light that rip through reality. So if you imagine ripping a piece of paper, but that being a three-dimensional rip in space, so just like in the air, a rip, and then a little orb about the size of a fist flying through the air before it almost like pops out of reality. It rips out of reality. So it doesn't appear from nothing to something. It literally came from somewhere. At least that's what it looked like to my human eyes. That's how I made sense of it. But does anybody else, and I've seen that many times, there's been times that I can call them in and they show themselves. Anybody else out there have, someone says lots of wild dreams. Yes, as a child. My sister, so my nephew used to speak about being born on other planets. And why am I talking about this? Because us having different perspectives to view reality offers us more of a strong, stable position. So it's like triangulating. As we gain alternative perspectives of reality, it allows us to sit within this reality stronger because we have multiple viewpoints. If we only have one viewpoint, we're really shaky, especially if one of these other perspectives or somebody else walks into our life and starts to say things a little bit differently. It really can wobble us off of our foundation. And so really being open and flexible with perspective allows us to be more founded in this reality because we're choosing it. We realize that it's different, that there's different ways to look at it, and we're choosing to be here now in this time and space, and we also can go somewhere else. My dad had an interaction in the 70s. He said, and yes, I have been in the 12 rings. They get in frequency to be visible. Exactly. So if we're speaking of other dimensions, there's a speed or a pace that we operate on this dimension. And just like here, we travel through physical reality. In some of these other dimensions, there is no physical reality. I should say densities, but densities and dimensions, for lack of time to explain the difference. But we travel through physical space. It's one of the gifts of this 3D or 4D reality. We also experience time linearly. And so we move through physical space and we move unidirectionally through time. That we don't really have much of a choice of, kind of. There are ways to slow and or connect, but while we're in this time and space, we move through physical space. Now, other beings don't have that luxury of physical space, but they do other things like move through time by choice. They steer their way through time, or they even steer their way through consciousnesses, which is the phenomenon of channeling, where entities can signal or choose a consciousness to join with and either speak through or act through. And so we get the benefit of moving through space. Others have the benefit of traveling through time. Others have the benefit of traveling through consciousnesses. And with that perspective, it really starts to open up the possibility that we're more than just ourselves. My soul constantly has the sensation of, I want to go home. And so do I if I go on a long vacation. And I'm sure a lot of us do as well. And if you were on that long vacation and you assumed that you would never go home, that would create some disruption. And so this is where we are now. And then it's up to all of us to determine what happens when we graduate out of this existence. And having the flexibility and perspective so that we can at least determine that we came here by choice. Again, just a mind experiment we can run. We came here by choice, and we are here now. And just like on vacation, we can still be homesick and enjoy the ride while we're here. What do you think about the dowsing rods? So my father showed me dowsing rods before I even knew anything about this. I think I was like young, under 10 years old. And he gave me these two pieces of metal that he just got out of his garage. And he said, walk across the yard. And I walked across the yard, and right where the water pipe was, because he built our house with his bare hands, so he knew where the water pipe was. right where the water pipe was, the dowsing rods crossed. And so dowsing rods are real. Anybody who says that they don't work are usually the people that just say that they don't work. And that's the thing. In life, there's 3 different people that analyze things, right? Or give advice. And we would hopefully get a balanced opinion from at least 2 of the 3 sides. All right. One of the 3 is completely useless. So there's the people that have tried it and failed. There's the people that have tried it and succeeded. And then there's the people who've never tried it. Now, just because of chance, the people who have never tried a single thing in your life are probably going to be most of the people, right? Because most of the people haven't done all of the things that there is to do on this world. So a lot of the chatter that you're going to hear from a lot of people are going to be from this third crowd, people who have never tried it. All right, and then there's going to be the people that have tried it and succeeded, and the people that have tried it and failed. Guess which out of these 2 are the loudest? The ones that have the mind that has to make sense of their failure, right? So the loudest is going to be the ones that tried it and failed. The ones that have tried something and succeeded, they really have no need to be loud. And I'm talking about anything. They have their results to speak for. They're not trying to convince anybody, but the convincers are the ones who failed, because the job of the mind is to make sense out of reality. So if you have an identity as somebody who does things right, and then all of a sudden things don't go that way, now your mind starts putting up an argument of reasons to justify it, and then you have turmoil inside of you, so you like to chatter it out to diffuse the energy. So as us, as beings, when we come across things, make sure that you recognize whoever you're listening to, whether it's online or in person, which 3 avenues is this person? Is it somebody who's never done it before? Because I've seen a lot of dowsing videos with comments that say like, that doesn't work because blah, blah, blah. There's no experience there. They're just basing it on something they learned in a class somewhere. And then there's the people that have done it that literally don't even put up an argument, like I just did. Like, I tried it before I even knew how to fake it. Now, I think there's another question about dowsing rods that talk to angels. And I think that's the same as applied physiology. So now the question is applied physiology. What is applied physiology? It's basically being able to speak to whatever else is the greater version of us through things like dowsing rods or pendulums, or even muscle testing if you want to use our self. I think that's where the question's coming from. There's not really an exact question on here. But the question is, do I believe that works? I don't want to be from that third I would be speaking from that third avenue. So my answer to that question is, I don't actually have personal experience with it. However, there's no reason for me to discount somebody else who does utilize that exact method. The inner being, as Abraham refers to it, as maybe. So pendulums and muscle testing are interesting practices, because that's essentially going beyond what our Western science states. It's essentially mechanical, it's mechanistic, and it's what's the word? It's very simplified. It's reductionist. It's also compartmentalized. What I mean by that is we take things, we chop it up into pieces, and we try to understand the whole picture by understanding the pieces. And those pieces get in smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. We separate things into certain scenarios, and we say, if this is happening, then this is what's going to happen within this smaller piece, so then the whole must operate in this way. And the exciting thing about science being like that is that we're not discovering very much, that science will continuously disprove itself because we're not looking at things from a position of true observation within nature. We set up experiments. The mere implication of an experiment is that the experience is unnatural. We've put up walls and boundaries to the experiment, and then we're watching what happens within the parameters that we set. And true science is observation of the natural world. And we all get to do that constantly. That's how we all learn. We recognize patterns within our environment, which is natural. Even if man built that back there, it's a naturally built environment. So we can look at how humankind behaves within our environment, and we can also recognize science within nature. And Western science could serve a purpose, or it could be completely wrong, because the conditions of a laboratory are never the conditions of nature. So if we're experimenting with biological cells within a laboratory that has air from who knows what, it has water from who knows where, it's in a plastic or glass beaker, it's underneath lights that are not the sun. We have no idea about there's a lot of factors that are not accounted for. They could be equal between the two experiments, but the equalness may not be what is equal to nature. You take a cell out of a body, now that cell is operating from a different state. And so, not to mention, our consciousness is impacting all experiments. All experiments are being impacted by our consciousness. And that's been proven time and time again. Asking a question, did it work? I'm not sure what you were referring to, but if it was the dowsing rods, yes, it did. Easily. Like magically. Epigenetics, maybe. Yes, epigenetics. Epi means on top of genetics. So there's the genetics are the, let's call it color, right? So do I have blonde hair? Do I have brown hair? And then epi means on top of that, that's the volume of our genetics. Like how much or how little do our genes get expressed, which is an amazing thing because I was taught when I was younger that genes are genes. You can't control your genes, but now there's epigenetics, which is like, well, there's actually a volume knob to our genes, and it's epigenetics, and epigenetics are completely influenced by nurture. So there's nature and nurture. Epigenetics are influenced by lifestyle. Any other otherworldly experiences out there? Because when you see something that shouldn't be, it can change everything. One concept that I really like is this concept that consciousness, like I said, if you're at a certain level of vibration that is very strong, you can overpower others' frequency, other beings' frequencies. So Bashar talks about how when he meets the extraterrestrial that he interacts with, that being's frequency is so strong that it overpowers Daryl's frequency, so that his consciousness is no longer within his body, but his consciousness actually gets pulled into the body of the ET, and then he now is viewing himself from the perspective of the other. And just hearing that story allows you to make a whole bunch of paradigm shifts in your mind, whether it's true or not. But a lot of those shifts of perspectives allows you to improve and enhance your life, because you start to realize the more aligned I am, the stronger my field is. If I can resonate at a powerful place, then I have impact over reality, just like some beings have that amount of influence over reality that they pull in other consciousnesses into alignment with them. Now, as humans here, we may not ever get to that level, but we do see some people being highly influential and some people being highly moldable, like highly influenceable. We call it gullible to a degree. And there's that spectrum. And where are we on that spectrum? And do we realize that as humans, we may just inherently have that ability over other things like plants? Anybody have the experience of you being angry or upset for several weeks and your plants all start to die? Your frequency is impacting their frequency. And vice versa, probably, but I also have that experience with dogs as well. Just trying to see some questions here. Okay. This all started because it was about grounding. So a lot of us don't realize the feet are meant to connect with the earth. All right, that's why there's sweat glands on it. The feet have more sweat glands than any other body part of that same size in the body. 200,000 sweat glands per square inch, if my memory serves me correctly. How does cats affect our frequency? Do I want to go on that tangent? There's a book called Initiation, written by Elizabeth W.H. I forget the actual W something. But in the book Initiation, the author remembers multiple lifetimes. And so the first 100 pages, we're going through all of her lifetimes that she's remembering. And we get to one lifetime that makes up about 300 pages. And that lifetime is she's a pharaoh in Egypt's daughter. And if you don't want me to, I'm going to just tell the whole story because I'm sick of like mentioning a book and then don't saying it. So if you don't want to hear the actual book and you want to read it, go for it. But you hearing this isn't going to ruin the book. But it is an amazing experience to go through it. But it's a long book. So to save you that, you hear all of her lifetimes. Then there's 300 pages of her being a pharaoh's daughter, and she gets a wish on her 18th birthday or 16th birthday, something like that, and her wish is to become initiated, to become a high priest. And the pharaoh and the high priest says no. Like her father and the high priest, which I don't know if it was his brother, but they say no because you haven't experienced the full spectrum of life. You haven't been in love. Like she hasn't went into, I don't even think she had sex at that point. And they said, you're not fully capable of working with the energies in your body because you haven't gone down this road yet. I don't, and this is all about cats, so I'm getting to the cat question. So anyways, she goes through the initiation practice, and it's amazing because if you take what Junvolo Melchizedek wrote, do I have these books in here? Wrote in these two books, Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And actually, there's a Russian guy, is he Russian or German? Russian scientist, he's a physicist who I met a few weeks ago, and I'm also going to interview him on my podcast. He claims that he knows Drunvalo, and he wrote Volume 3 of this, or the upgraded version of this. And I started reading that book. It's called Music of the Divine Spheres, something like that. But admittedly, that book was way too complex for me to even comprehend. I read like 2 chapters and I was losing it. But anyways, in those books it talks about the initiation practices in Egypt, but in the book Initiation she talks about going through the initiation practices in Egypt, and it's all about controlling the energies of the body, the emotions of the body. And there's interesting practices because first she goes by just recognizing fear, love, and anger, and joy. And then they start teaching her how to call those in to manifestation, like call them up, utilize the energies. And at first she would have to imagine scenarios to make her angry, and imagine a scenario to make her joyful, and imagine a scenario to make her excited, and be able to go from excited to guilt to anger to joy, and be able to flow through the emotional body like that. And then eventually she could just do it, just on call, without any sort of prompting internally. And that was a practice, that was a skill. In Drunvalo's book, they say it takes 26 years to become an initiate. In the book Initiation, they had the elongated skulls. So she was an elongated skull being. She called those beings the sons of gods. And then the round-headed beings like we are now were the sons of man. And she goes through this long process to become initiated. And one of the final things after you become initiated, she becomes a high priestess, and she then gets a cat. She gets a lion. I believe it's lions, not tigers. But she gets a lion. And because her frequency was so strong, cats have a much stronger frequency, and she was able to be very influential and kin to the lion. And this is where I'm at the point, like, do I tell the rest of the book? Because then it gets to the very, very end. I'll tell the rest of the book. So eventually she gets seduced by some neighboring person. And that's the part of her concept that she never strengthened or fortified before coming into initiation. And so she essentially gets penetrated and falls in consciousness. And you've heard the saying, like, the higher you go, the longer you fall. Well, she falls literally beyond this life. Her lion kills her because now the lion doesn't recognize her as divine. And her spirit falls down many, many, many levels in consciousness. So she was like up, influencing reality, using her emotional energy, but there was a kink in her armor, and she falls down to basically the status of a rock. And that was my interpretation. It might not be exactly like that, but because I also have some other influences of what levels of consciousness are and how we start as mineral, water, light, air, and those minerals combine. I'm going on a tangent now, but it's going to be part of the story. And those minerals combine into consciousness that is aware, like plants and animals. And as we live many, many, many generations as a plant or an animal, we're building our awareness into self-awareness. And when we have self-awareness, we're ready to be human. And when we're human, we're strengthening our self-awareness so that we can become aware of others. And when we're aware of others, then we're something other than human. We're like the next stage of human. And then we can start connecting with our minds. And then we're the next stage of human after that. And then so now we're all living individual experiences, but we are all learning from each other emotionally and mentally. And then after that, there's less of a need for us to have individual experiences, so we become bodiless, we become disembodied. And now this is now where these are these entities that we're talking about that are no longer operating within this physical space and time, because they've learned everything that there is to learn in this linear time, physical dimension space as a humanoid on, let's say, another planet like Venus, which is where the being Ra that visited Egypt, and also visited some scientists in the 70s or 80s and wrote a book series called The Law of One. And now they're a collection of entities. Ra calls it a social memory complex. It's all of the humans that lived on Venus and all the time that they lived in linear time and physical space. It's all of those consciousness collected into one etherical entity. And it can come in one form and label itself a name like Ra and talk to the Egyptians and tell them the secrets of the universe, and then the Egyptians misused it. That goes the story. But all of this is to say that when she goes and falls down, she gets entombed, and she's in this tomb for like thousands of years, and she gets reborn into other bodies. And that first 100 pages of the book were all of the other bodies that she was being reborn into to work her way back up to the level where she was at before as a high priestess. So it was like this big cycle. You first go through the individual experiences, and then you witness the building of initiation, and then the fall from grace, and then now you're back at the beginning of the story, which was all of the lifetimes. It's an amazing book. It was one of those books when I was getting done with it, I was like, I had to sit in the moment, like, wow, what a story. I highly recommend that book. It's called Initiation. It's one of my favorite books. I was actually just thinking of reaching out to the author and see if I can talk to her specifically. If anybody knows her, make an intro. But the point of that was, the reason why I reminded me of that was because somebody asked about cats, and how cats nowadays, they're not really influenced by us, right? They're kind of like, they're like ascended in a way. And in that book, it kind of explains why. And then it also says that man will become, number one, they say that the sons of man, which is us, will become, will have their abilities, have the ability to have their abilities. But also we will fall in consciousness, and we will, well, not fall, but as we start to gain more abilities, we're going to start to have similar influence that they had over lions with donkeys and horses. And that's kind of our start into being able to be influential with the animals. And what Ra says with our animals, if you guys have pets, is that, remember that spectrum I was just talking about of going from mineral, air, water, into plants and animals, into humans that can interact emotionally, into humans that can know every other human's thoughts on the entire planet. That process, in that process, the higher density entities come down to help the lower density entities ascend, because that helps them ascend. So the whole point of that is to get to oneness. And oneness implies that we are all one, which is why the books are called The Law of One. And so if we are all one, we must pick up the lower density entities and teach them the ways so that their consciousness graduates through these stages. And what is implied there, when the questioner, which I believe there was 2 or 3 questioners. I think there was one main questioner, but they were essentially scientists. One guy is like a professor in engineering or something, but they made a person into a piece of technology that can receive signals from other dimensions. and they were channeling different entities. One of the entities was in a spaceship floating above Earth, and forgive me, it's been like over 10 years since I read these books. I want to say Chiron was the name, but I don't think that was the name. I think it started with a K on page like 30. Like if I had the books, I could flip through it. But anyways, it would be, I do know where they are. It's downstairs. But the entity says to the people in the room, they say like, can you know what we're thinking? And they say, yes, I know exactly everything that you're thinking. And then the questioner says, well, don't you think that's invasion of privacy? And the entity says, I can see how from your perspective you feel it's invasion of privacy, but from my perspective, I am you and you are me. So it's not invasion of my own privacy for me to know my own individual thoughts as you are. It's like just us knowing what our finger is thinking. That's how this being in a spaceship above Earth, and who even knows that word spaceship, we get these ideas of what that means. I don't think it's necessarily physical like we're sold in Hollywood, but he's there and he's communicating, saying like, the reason why you're even hearing the words is because we are of the same essence. I still didn't get to the point, which is what are we doing with our dogs? Our dogs and pets, we're helping them ascend. A lot of us unconsciously, but I definitely can see the evolution of my pets in my lifetime, how I've been able to teach them self-awareness so that they're aware of self. They know to do certain things to benefit themselves, like to sit down before getting fed and ask to go outside and to, what do you want? Let me know exactly what they want. He goes and he stares at his leash, he stares at the door, he stares at the refrigerator, he stares at where his treats are. Which door does he stare at? He can stare in the backyard door or the front door, which is where we go on walks. So lots of beautiful perspectives that we have on this planet. Trying to figure out which one is true or false, I think, is an endless game, because that would imply that there's only one reality. And you may not have a solid foundation if you're starting from a stance that may or may not be true, because we cannot really prove one way or the other if this is even real. So it kind of leaves it open to interpretation. Is this a matrix? Are we an alien ant farm? Is the theory of evolution correct, where it's just a bunch of random stuff happening and then all of a sudden 13 billion years later and 5 billion years after this gravitational structure of the galaxy and our solar system popped us, like the schools say? To me, I don't think knowing what people's thoughts and feelings should be known until they let it known. That would be very intrusive to me. Exactly, as an individual. So being rooted in our individualness is what the lower spectrum of the spectrum that we're on. Eventually, the reason why we have individual experiences is so that we can share it with the collective. And that makes the collective stronger. Right? So it would be like the cell on our hand and the cell next to it on our hand, the skin cells. At one level, they can't sense what each other is feeling, but this grander entity called their self, we can. And eventually, as they're graduating from that entity to this entity, they gain an awareness of all of the cells, because that's what they are. And we are selves in the same manner. Again, this is just the perspective from Ra, not me. We're talking about like capital R, capital A, Ra. Telepathy is now whether we want it or not. Yes, of course. I mean, it's happening. The story of that is with our phones as well. We are telecommunicating with our phones and letting others know what we are thinking, what we are doing, how we are feeling through our devices. I personally feel that it's a very great way to base perspective. Because if we base it from the opposite, which is we are individuals, we only are living once, that's a very competitive mindset. And that's the mindset that we're taught. And when we look at the problems in the world, there's that saying, you can't fix a problem with the same mindset that caused it, that created it. And the mindset that I see that created things is that we're all individuals. And that's something that can be very easily proven and justified every single day. When I go to bed, I'm not going to bed as multiple people. I'm going to bed as myself. When I wake up as myself. So from a basic, simple level, it's very easy to convince myself that I'm an individual. Just like the individual cells of our body all probably feel like they're individuals, just like the leaves on a tree all probably feel like they're individuals. But from an outside perspective, when we look at that tree and we see those leaves, we can very clearly see that they're part of a grander organism. Even if the leaves aren't aware of it, even if the leaves live out their entire life cycle, we can watch that. We can watch the leaves live out from spring to fall. They literally bloom and die. And those leaves might not have ever recognized the truth that they were part of a larger entity that we can see that's called the tree. And so we can take that perspective and then ponder. This is just a ponderance. It's a philosophical experiment. Like, am I the leaf on something else called the tree? You don't have to go there, but what does that mean? And then you can start looking for proof to justify that. Just like you can justify being an individual, is there proof to justify us being connected all as one? And I found that there's more proof to justify that than me being an individual. I find that my state of awareness directly impacts reality, perfectly impacts reality. And I can see everybody's state of awareness. And then the question is like, well, what about the kids that are getting raped on the other side of the world? Well, what kind of clothes are you wearing? Are all of the clothes in your entire house made fairly, or is some of them using child labor and slave labor and sweat factories and people going into mines to find certain minerals to make toxic dyes that they're working on for 20 hours a day and going home and sleeping in a hut? Because that's you participating in it all, which then brings it back to my main point. How we are being is how everything is being. And to me, it makes perfect sense. When I look out into the world and I see everything that's happening, I can see the reflection of how I'm being, even though I convince myself that I'm being the best that I can be and I'm not really participating in any of that. No, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff, even just looking at the houses that we're in, that, trees that had to be cut down and the microorganisms in the soil just get shoved away and die, and we have very little respect for certain forms of life on this earth. And it makes sense that greater powerful entities are utilizing us the same way that we utilize the earth and the animals and the plants on this scale, on this spectrum. And it's one level is eating the level beneath it, which is eating the level beneath it, which is eating the level beneath it. And honestly, when I look at that from not a point of view of good or bad, but from a point of view of like, this is what's happening, it actually seems to be a pretty well-functioning organism. The higher levels feed on the lower levels. It's functioning. When we go into nature, we see the same thing. Things eating other things, like things dying, other things eating those. Otherwise, the new life wouldn't be able to exist. And it all kind of makes sense. And we can make all sorts of justifications from that, and that's where I would trust and hope that we all, as good people, have the strong influence over the direction of our species as a consciousness, as a collective. Being different individuals is what makes this world so different and unique and so beautiful to witness. Exactly, which is the whole point of whatever split itself into all of us individuals, so that they can experience all there is to experience on Earth. Imagine you're the thing, you're the Alpha, the Omega, the God, and there's all of existence to explore. How do you explore it? How do you split yourself up into a whole bunch of different pieces so that you can know and experience all there is to know and experience? This is the teachings of this symbol as well. It starts with that being in the center here at one point, and he goes and he explores as far as he can reach, and that creates the first circle. Then he goes to the edge of the first circle, and he goes out from there, and he makes another circle, and now you have two circles, which then forms the Vesica Pisces. That symbol right there, anybody recognize that? It's the symbol of the fish, the symbol of Jesus, right? So like the whole Bible and the whole first 7 days of creation is explained in the aspect of creation going out to its edges. And, once you're out here, then you go explore all of the other edges, and you get eventually the flower of life. And so there's like 450 pages to explain that amongst two books. But that's what this symbol, the flower of life, which is one of the most ancient symbols found all over the world, that's the story it tells. Because the English, the words that we use to tell the same story, is very limiting to what the geometry tells. So geometry would be the language of the physical universe, because it's not limited by the words. Words are essentially, like I was talking about science, it's cutting down things like, this is a book. Well, it's not only a book, this is something greater than a book, but we know it as a book. It makes it easy for us to communicate with each other. So if I say, hey, can you hand me that book? You know what I'm talking about. But is this only a book? No, it's not. I don't even have the words to explain how that's possible, but it's more than book. But our language says this is book. And so that's what we know it as. Or it says these are just a bunch of squiggly lines and they don't mean anything. But when you start looking at geometry, you can see that geometry is grand. All right, y'all. So my Instagram is raw_of_earth. If you guys have any questions, especially from the Human Garage crew, of how some of their teachings, if you'd like my perspective on that or my perspective on anything else, just send me, just say like, hey, I'm from Human Garage, talk about this next week. And I'll have some questions that I can go over and give my prepared answers for, or just come on and ask me questions. And I really like going on tangents naturally as well. But until then, I was going to do a Kriya today, but maybe next week we'll do a Kriya to bring more awareness outside of ourselves. Because the great thing with Kriyas is that sometimes when we're doing the Kriyas, we are doing it in such a way, and the reason why it's kind of hard to do it on a live is because we're doing things for several minutes and people don't really enjoy watching that. But I do have Kriyas in some of my programs. But when you do a Kriya, sometimes you're doing stuff with breath or like with your arms overhead, and let's say you're moving your arms, you're inhaling your arms up and exhaling them down. And if you're doing this for, let's say, 7 minutes, it eventually gets to the point where your physical body starts getting tired. And then you're faced with a choice. Do I keep on going or do I stop? But once you get past that choice, then it's like, okay, where do I get the power to keep on going? And you start asking questions and start reaching out into the outer realms of yourself, and you can start feeling that there's more power than just skin in that you can access within these Kriyas, and it opens up your body energetically to receive that power, because we're taught that the power in our body comes in through here, through our breath, through our nose and our mouth with the breath, and then the food that we eat. However, when you're in a Kriya, you recognize that there's other ways to receive that energy. And in Taoism, they call them gates of the body. There's gates in the body where you can bring in more energy, like the perineum, the kidneys, the navel point, the throat. These are areas where we can pull in energy into our meridians, into our energy system that can then distribute the energy throughout our body. And being aware of that makes it so that we're not just limited by this capacity. That's what we're taught, right? Anyways. Thank you all for joining and making this conversation exciting for everybody. What is your account, Ra, R-A _of_Earth. Ra of Earth.